So this is a meeting about being on time. So we are going to just start. My name is Lawrence Fung. I'm a child psychiatrist here at Stanford. I'd like to introduce Dr. Deb Karhson. She is a postdoctoral researcher in Dr. Karen Parker's lab here at Stanford. So she's going to start talking about science of the potential use of cannabis in autism. And then I'll talk about some of the clinical evidence. And finally, Dr. Da Paz will wrap up with yet another topic on this on stress.
What happened? Okay, it's coming up. Okay, so we presented this talk in the previous breakout session. It was entitled "Cannabis and the Treatment of Autism. Are we ready?" Yes. So before we answer the question, for me, let's disambiguate the question. What is that question really asking? Where it starts, ideally, or like where it theoretically started in the community, was through anecdotal evidence. And the most famous child probably who uses cannabis oil would be the person on the screen, which is Charlotte Figi. She has Dravet syndrome and was featured in all of Dr. Sanjay Gupta's documentaries on weed, which were entitled Weed. That is not my language, that is his language. So when we're looking at Charlotte Figi, what are we really thinking about, and what are we saying in the sense that Charlotte Figi found successful treatment with cannabis oil? What we're saying is that Charlotte Figi had Dravet syndrome, which is an epilepsy disorder. And what cannabis oil treated was her epilepsy syndrome or her Dravet's, right? So specifically her seizures. Now, when we're trying to translate that into autism and trying to understand how does that fit into autism, what we're looking at is, or what does the question then becomes, can cannabis treat autism and autism plus, right? So here, the two biggest role models, probably, if we want to call them that, would be Miko Hester Perez's son, Joey, and Alex Eccles. So Joey Hester Perez has autism plus, and that means he has autism as well as muscular dystrophy, and found a lot of benefit in terms of using cannabis oil that were centered on benefits for muscular dystrophy, right? So the benefits that Miko Hester Perez's son saw were for his muscular dystrophy. And for Alex Eccles, what his parents were looking to treat were his self-injurious behaviors. He had autism, or has autism and tuberous sclerosis, right, or TSC, as well as seizures. So in terms of how effective was the cannabis oil for him, his parents on their blog identify that a lot of the effects that they saw were specific to his seizures and to his self-injurious behaviors, right? Not necessarily autism or the core features of autism, right? So going forward, what does that mean, right? How do we translate that into a question that we can ask within a research lab, right? And when we're translating these questions into rigorous scientific research, we want there to be a driving hypothesis which helps us progress our basic understanding of autism as well, right? So we're not just asking, does it change something? We're asking, does it change the actual biology of autism? But what is the biology of autism? That's a great question. We're still working on it in general across the field, okay? So since we can't understand since we can't use the biology of autism to help us understand what is cannabis doing, we have to go and look at the biology of cannabis, right? And maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but cannabis acts upon a specialized system called the endocannabinoid system. The endo part of that word being from endogenous or native. So this is a system that is already in your body, that has been in your body and has always been in your body, right? That's why cannabis is so effective. It's because it's acting upon a specialized system. Much like insulin acts upon a specialized system, cannabis is acting on a specialized system. In that specialized system, we have two locks that cannabis is unlocking, right? Or two major locks that we're looking at. CB1, or cannabinoid receptor type 1, and cannabinoid receptor type 2. Very imaginative names, okay? So CB1 is mostly found in the brain, and CB2 is mostly found in the immune system. That means they have two distinct spatial locations, which means if we're putting cannabis and we're unlocking those locks with cannabis, we're having distributed effects both in the brain and in the body, okay? And the body one is, when I say body, I mean immune system, okay? So if the receptors are the lock and cannabis is the key, what specifically are the keys within cannabis? Cannabis is a giant plant. It has a lot of things going on. In our body, we know that these two keys, or the two major keys we talk about the most, are anandamide and 2-AG. They're on the left side of the gray box. Those two endogenous versions, or native cannabinoids in our body, relate to two plant-based cannabinoids, THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or cannabidiol, which is CBD, okay? And if you look at the picture on the bottom right, you can see that anandamide, 2-AG, and THC this is a graphical representation, right? Not their actual crystal structures, right? But this is gonna help us understand a little bit what they're doing. You can see that anandamide, 2-AG, and THC have a really good fit in terms of the locks for the cannabinoid receptors. CBD is kind of like the weird guy in the room. He doesn't really fit in, but he still likes to hang out, okay? So what's really interesting was that the action of the endocannabinoid system neatly parallels the symptom domains of autism. What does that mean? That means the endocannabinoid system is implicated in a wide variety of functions that matter to us in autism. This includes cognitive functioning, social functioning, emotional regulation, energy balance, and even food intake, right? So if you have autism happening in any of those domains, which we know it happens in all of those domains, sometimes all of them, sometimes some of them, we can say that the endocannabinoid system, because it acts in all of those system domains as well, maybe it is in fact getting at the biology or part of the biology of autism. But what then is cannabis as a huge class or a huge plant, a whole plant? What is it actually doing? So if we really define the terms of what cannabis is, right? The current studies are looking at a top-down action of cannabis. Can we take cannabis as a whole plant and change the behavior that we see in autism? But cannabis, if we really look at it, what are the active components? There are three major categories that we're looking at for components of cannabis. The first of which being flavonoids. And these molecules, typically, when we're looking at cannabis, are the non-green components. And they are aromatic molecules, right? Unique to this class of flavonoids for cannabis are called cannaflavins. And these are flavonoids that are only found in cannabis. They're pharmacologically active, and they're boosters in terms of reducing inflammation, right? So if cannabis is having an effect, maybe the effect is being driven by cannaflavins, right? Or maybe it's been driven by terpenoids and terpenes. The difference between terpenes and terpenoids is aging and drying, right? So it's just a different active form. And again, terpenoids, they're not specific to cannabinoids. We see them in a lot of other different organic matter, but within cannabis, they tend to give us that characteristic smell that we tend to have. They're also pharmacologically active in cannabis, even at percents that are subclinical, so 0.05% concentration of terpenoids is still pharmacologically active, right? So even if it's very, very trace amounts of terpenoids, because they're a booster to the therapeutic action of the major cannabinoids, we're still seeing effects, right? So maybe when we're saying, okay, is cannabis treating autism, maybe it's the flavonoids, maybe it's the terpenoids, or maybe it's the big workhorse, right? Cannabinoids themselves. But what does that even mean, right? Cannabinoids, there are over 100 that are identified within literature, right? The ones that we tend to specifically be referencing are phytocannabinoids. And while the two major phytocannabinoids that we talk about are delta-9 THC, delta-9 THC or cannabidiol, there are other new kids on the block that are coming up that seem to be pharmacologically active and of interest in terms of clinical development for drugs, right? And these are names that you've probably heard thrown around in the community: CBDV, CBDA, CBN, CBG, CBC, THC, right? So there are a lot of them. So when we say, is cannabis a useful drug for autism? First, we have to say, okay, what part of cannabis what are we talking about, right? And then we have the issue that cannabis itself is polypharmaceutical, right? So cannabinoids are polypharmaceutical. The therapeutic workhorse, oftentimes when we're talking about the medical benefits of cannabis are related to cannabidiol or CBD, right? Most times in our clinical studies, in our preclinical models, our animal models, right, where we see medical benefit, this is all being driven by selective cannabinoids, right? CBD in particular. Sometimes THC, but not often, right? And this is because CBD tends to there's a ton of preclinical evidence demonstrating CBD is active for a stress response and for neuroinflammation, both of which have been suggested may be mechanisms for autism, right? So if we're, again, asking the question, does cannabis treat autism? Well, is it treating a stress response? Is it treating a neuroinflammation response? Is CBD doing the work? We don't know, right? Then we have to think about the entourage effect, right? So it's not just CBD. Sometimes if we're using whole plant extracts, right, we're pulling the entire plant, right? So all the molecules that are found within cannabis, right? And oftentimes when we try to simulate that in the lab, we're using more than one cannabinoid. So THC in addition to THC, or CBD in addition to THC, right? And what we know is that if we're using whole plant extracts, we're also getting a little bit of the flavonoids, a little bit of the terpenoids, right? And those tend to, because they're boosters, if we're using a whole plant extract, we're gonna see different effects, right? So 100 milligrams of synthetic CBD is not gonna have the same therapeutic action as whole plant extract, because whole plant extract has its whole gang with it, or its entourage. It's called the entourage effect, right? There's a beautiful name for it. So it's not just THC or CBD, which is oftentimes what we're using in clinical trials or clinical evidence or in studies with animal models, right? We're using one cannabinoid or the other, whereas in community-based data, what we're seeing is more likely an entourage effect because we're using whole plant extracts. So chemistry is power here, right? And what oftentimes is happening in the community is artisanal products are saying, oh yeah, we have a ton of CBD, none of that THC stuff, that's psychedelic, right? But that's not oftentimes the case, right? There was a research study put to JAMA, right? The Journal of American Medicine, which is like a big deal, of this year. And they said, great, okay, so if everybody's going out and buying cannabidiol, are they actually getting cannabidiol? The answer was no, right? And this is where rigorous scientific research comes into play, because we want to know specifically what is happening in cannabis, what is specifically treating autism if we're going to be using it as a drug, right? So we have the complication with trying to understand what cannabis is, trying to understand its target of action, and then we have the further complication of its biochemical consumption, right? So every time we ingest cannabis or we're trying to use it as a medicine, what is happening, right? The mode of translation or the mode of ingestion changes its function or its pharmacological action. So in terms of ingestion, it's difficult to titrate if you're eating, right? And there's, due to its effects on the liver, right, it actually is converted into a more potent form when it is ingested. So THC becomes 11-hydroxy-THC, which lasts longer and is more potent. And then those effects, right, are modulated by the person's existence in and of itself. Weight gain, or weight, metabolism, gender, and diet, right? So if you exist and you're ingesting cannabis, are you getting what you think you're getting? Questionable, very questionable, right? For sublingual, oftentimes people try to get around this ingestion because we'll take it sublingually. And this means that if we put it in our mouth, we're gonna get direct action into the bloodstream. Similar effects are seen with combustion through smoking and vaporization. We're trying to get the action of cannabinoids directly into the bloodstream. Does this always work? Sometimes. Does it have different lengths of action? Absolutely. So depending on your mode of ingestion can change the pharmacological action, which only further complicates the understanding of whether or not we can use cannabis as a treatment for autism, right? So now that we understand the complexity of cannabis in research, what is happening in terms of the clinical pipeline? So we have I know there's a lot of talk in the community in terms of what is happening with these different companies, GW Pharmaceutical being the most notable company, right? So GW has a host of cannabinoid-based therapeutics, Stativex for multiple sclerosis, and PDLX, which has been used with high efficacy in epilepsy. And that is a 99% CBD formulation from a whole plant extract. So that's why it may be super efficacious in its most recent randomized control trials, right? But what is GW looking at in terms of its pipeline for autism? It's looking at the orphan autisms, right? So it's not trying to hit across the entire spectrum. It's going for what we know in terms of autisms that are the biological mechanisms are more well-defined, right? And so those are usually Rett syndrome and Fragile X. Fragile X has the most amount of preclinical animal model data demonstrating endocannabinoid dysregulation, right? So the system that we're talking about is most often looked at in terms of Fragile X. That's why both GW is looking at it and why Zynerba is looking at it, right? Zynerba is only a little different in that they're using a synthetic cannabinoid or a synthetic CBD, right? So it's not a whole plant extract. So is it going to be useful? Don't know. These are good questions. Right? So really, what are the questions that we're talking about when we're asking, are we ready for cannabis and autism? We're asking, is cannabis treating core or associated symptoms, right? Ideally for drugs or drug development for autism, we want to treat specific core features of autism. That's anything that's falling within the DSM, right? Sensory reactivity, social functioning, or cognitive functioning. Is cannabis treating any of those? We don't know. Then we need to know what cannabinoids are doing what. Because that's the only path forward to specifically treating specific portions of autism, specific aspects of autism. And then finally, should we be treating autism the same way that we treat epilepsy or Fragile X? Where do we slice up the spectrum, and who do we give what drugs and how do we treat them is a really critical question, right? We don't want to just throw a hammer that is cannabis at autism and say, break the ceiling, make all the things go away. That's not useful for anybody, right? We want to be very precise in terms of how we're utilizing this polypharmaceutical to treat a very heterogeneous brain disorder, right? So the path forward is definitely a patient-centered precision psychiatry methodology. And to talk a little bit about that is Dr. Fung.
Thank you, Dr. Karhson. So the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about basically results from 2 clinical studies of cannabidiol, so not cannabis, but the CBD component in epilepsy. And it's really treatment-resistant epilepsy that we're talking about. The first study is an open-label study. That means there is no sugar pill to compare to. The second one is a randomized controlled trial. There's a sugar pill to compare with. And the second one also is more specific to Dravet syndrome, which is a genetic disorder that has epilepsy as a main symptom. And it is also, before I go over this study, it's also important to highlight that about 22% of the autism population has epilepsy. So it is actually quite common, is relevant. And also clinically, when we treat patients with autism that has epilepsy, when their epilepsy gets better, oftentimes their behavior actually gets better too. So this is good to put into context that, like, even if we don't have the behavioral data from here, it is still relevant to look at how the seizure reduction is panning out. So the first study, it has 214 patients. The mean age is 10 years old. They ramp up the dose of the cannabidiol from 2 to 5 milligram per kilogram per day up to about 25 to 50 milligram per kilogram per day. And it's a 12-week study. 76% of the participants are able to be included in the safety study and are able to complete the study. And you can see the graph on the right that here's the baseline. The baseline seizure frequency in the number per month. So it's about 30 here. And in about 12 weeks, it goes down to about 50%. So that's some efficacy in this open label study. And in terms of adverse events from this study, the main things that we are talking about are somnolence, about 25%. 1/5 has decreased appetite, 1/5 has diarrhea, 13% has fatigue, and 11% has convulsion. We're trying to treat epilepsy, but there are some cases that has increased seizures. Status epilepticus happens in 8%, and that's considered as a severe adverse event. About 30% of the patients from this study have severe adverse events. So the next study is a randomized control trial. This is published in New England Journal of Medicine, basically the flagship journal in medicine, period. And basically, they have a very strong set of data from 120 patients, children and young adults. The mean age is about 10 as well. All of these patients, either last study or this study, they are taking other medications for treating seizures. So, so definitely it's not like they're not taking anything, they're only taking the cannabidiol, they're taking some other anti-seizure medication. And that's important to note. And more than 60% of them are taking the medication called clobazam. It's a very effective medication for a lot of people with epilepsy. 60% on valproic acid, and 20 to 30% they are taking other medications such as topiramate. So they are taking the medication at low dose for about 2 weeks' time. They escalate to 20 milligram per kilogram per day, and have that maximum dose for about 12 weeks. And basically, what you can see is that the number of seizures also, it's like the last study. It decreased dramatically from 12 to 6. Compared to placebo, there's no change. So definitely, this efficacy is quite encouraging. Adverse events is actually a very similar story. I'm not going to repeat what I said from what I described in the last study. So basically, somnolence, diarrhea, fatigue, and decreased appetite, they are very real. And so the next thing that I want to talk about is the drug interaction, because this is something that you can potentially really do something about, because if someone is actually taking clobazam or valproic acid right now and you're thinking about starting cannabis, there is a known drug interaction. So what I want to describe is the science behind it. So basically, clobazam will be metabolized into norclobazam, which is also pharmacologically active. It will then be metabolized into the inactive metabolite by this enzyme called CYP2C19. And you know what? Cannabidiol actually inhibits the enzyme activity. And this is the result from one subject. There is actually coming from a study with 15 subjects, but this is a good illustration of the effects. So at time 0, basically that's the time when cannabidiol has not been started, but the patient has been taking clobazam for a while. The same clobazam dose is taken, but look at 8 weeks, there's about 60% increase. And what's even more remarkable is the increase in the norclobazam, 500% increase. So what you're thinking, what to put into perspective is like if you have a headache and you're taking Tylenol, you want to take 1, you're actually taking 6. So that means when you are taking clobazam, or your family member is taking clobazam, and if he or she is going to start cannabidiol, we know that this drug interaction actually happens. And what that means is that you need to monitor the medication. So all the epilepsy patients usually take medications that, I mean, not usually, there are a few of the medications that they need to have medication monitoring. So basically, over time, the doctor will be able to tell like is the level too high. Because if it's too high, it can be having side effects. And for valproate, it's actually similar story. It's less rigorous data, but the liver enzyme level actually increase with clobazam. I mean with CBD. So
brand names of those? What are the brand names of those drugs?
clobazam. Does anyone know?
Onfi.
Huh?
Onfi.
Onfi, yes, Onfi. ONFI is clobazam, and and valproic acid is Depakote. Thank you. So the take-home message here is the science of cannabis-related treatments is very complex. The pharmaceutical grade product is not existent right now readily. Most of them are most of the readily available formulations are non-pharmaceutical grade. The trials for epilepsy have very strong evidence for efficacy. So this is really an upside. We talk about the side effects, and we talk about the CBD interacting with some anti-seizure medication. And finally, we really want to push this forward. We really think there's a potential here, but we're just not ready to say that we are completely ready in all people. So definitely we have more confidence in some. That's what we probably want to say at this point. And you know, we are clinicians that we have to be responsible. So I'm just going to wrap up here and say there are 2 trials that are ongoing. Pregnenolone, it's a CB1 modulator, and there's a neuroimaging study that we're running. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Nikko Da Paz.
You want to do questions first?
Yeah, we can do questions now for a few minutes, and then and whoever that has questions can come to the microphone.
Did any of the individuals on the trial have what I would call a partial or complete response? I mean, getting rid of all seizures or half?
So seizure-free in the New England Journal study with the Dravet syndrome, 5% seizure-free with cannabidiol, 0% for placebo.
Excellent.
So it's a real effect.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Or comment, Jim?
So we give our son medical cannabis, and I found that, at least with him, and again, this is all anecdotally, that he didn't benefit at all from the CBD alone. But when we went heavier on the THC, we definitely saw pretty clear benefits. Can you explain chemically, maybe just, I know it's speculative, why that might be?
So that's probably the entourage effect that's happening. And you're not the only one. There's within the community and within the cannabinoid companies that are looking into autism as a area for development for drugs. There are 2 different pipelines that they're taking. One is looking at CBD alone. The other is looking at CBD plus. So that maybe that's adding THC, maybe that's adding other components that are found in cannabis. That's often, so a PDLX, which is the GW pharmaceutical product, that's why they use a whole plant extract. So even though it's a 99% CBD formulation, that doesn't mean that there isn't THC in there, and that doesn't mean that there aren't other cannaflavins or terpenoids that also could be active in that whole plant extract. What it means is that they're not testing for those other things, and that's why we don't know what's in there.
Hi.
Hi.
Because we don't have access to a PDLX, we have to use CBD products that we make ourselves. And so our ratio, rather than the amazing GW ratio of 90-to-1 or whatever they have, we're sort of at the 25-to-1 is our nominal ratio for what we've got. And by the time you go up to 15 or 20 milligrams per kilogram per day of CBD, you're giving the kid an awful lot of THC. And at least one member of our household committee is concerned because they keep coming across studies about the effect of THC on adolescent kid brains. And they're talking about, doses that are probably even lower than what we're delivering. And they're saying they're not convinced that that's a good thing to do to your kid's brain. And then there are people who say, well, but the CBD and the THC compete for receptors, and you don't get the same THC effects if you have all that CBD going on. What do people think about this?
What do people think? They think a lot of things. One is that there isn't enough research, there isn't enough money, and why is this plant a Class 1, Schedule 1 drug? Those hamper a lot of the information that we can understand, right? So like if the question is cannabis safe, tolerable, and effective for autism? We don't know that because we can't test it in a randomized control trial, which is the only way to definitively say that yes, cannabis would be safe, tolerable, and effective, right? And then that goes back to the question of what is cannabis, right? So in terms of THC and what is it doing, there's a ton of information, right? Both clinically in humans and in animal models that says THC is doing some wonky things in terms of development. We know that to be true. We know it's not just in adolescence, right? THC and the endocannabinoid system is implicated in like attachment of the fertilized egg to your uterine wall. Maybe not your uterine wall, I don't know. But in the sense that like the cannabinoid system, the endocannabinoid system is implicated from literally the start of your existence to the end of it. Right? And sometimes even after if we're looking at like inflammation. But what is THC doing? That's a great question. And if I could answer it, I'd probably have a Nobel Prize.
So in the interest of time, we only have 2 minutes left. So we have 2 minutes.
One question. I'm a parent, and I did a small, limited study on the cause of autism. They say that there's maybe a medium there that because of spontaneous conversation cannot be there because of some kind of medium there. I want to know if when using cannabis, are you also looking at the areas that you're looking at this is causing autism? Are you like some kind of not production? Don't know.
I know exactly. The
yes.
question that we're trying to get at.
You want to know if you're seeing that if something is being treated, as in quote unquote, do you see also the effect? What is causing this effect of cannabis on the?
So really excellent research, really rigorous scientific research is asking not just from a top down, if we put some cannabis on it, does it change behaviors? It's asking bottom up questions. Is there a reason to believe that cannabis is doing something that needed to be done, right? So for Stanford's research into cannabis and autism, what we're looking at is not just, is this changing behaviors, but what are the effects on biology, and does this tell us about the basic understanding of autism overall, right? That's the kind of research I'm doing, and I'm here, so.
So last question.
Okay, last question. So my son goes to a school where there's most of the students are actually on medical marijuana. And I would say 90% of them are on THC because all these kids they are not responding to CBD. They take THC and that's what calms them down. But now I'm hearing that THC is affecting like the brain of these adolescents. I mean, I don't see that it could do anything worse than they already are. I mean, they're pretty messed up. But I guess what I'm saying, I mean, how is it these kids are having paradoxical effects? I mean, with everybody else who would have the ingest amounts of THC that they would be getting, they'd be high as kites. But these kids are like mellow and chill.
So that question comes back to the endocannabinoid system, right? So if the difference between you and me is 0.1% of our DNA, right? And that makes super big changes between you and me. That means also the endocannabinoid changing. Endocannabinoid system between us is also relative to that giant change, even though it's only 0.1%, right? So this is where individual difference and precision psychiatry become really, really important, right? I don't want to just put cannabis on it. I want to understand specifically what is in cannabis that is treating core features of autism, and what do we mean by that? So in terms of THC,
I know, but you're saying it's individual, like between me and you and different, but I'm telling you, all these suckers
right,
are like,
right.
So, I mean, what is it?
So that's the question. That's the question, right? Like that. So when we're just looking at top-down questions, if we put cannabis on it, does it change behavior? What we're not asking is the bottom-up question: is there reason to believe that there was a necessary, like there was a need that we're fulfilling by adding cannabis to it, right? So if the endocannabinoid system is implicated in multiple system domains for autism, right? That means you have a wide variety of kids with a wide variety of changes across the endocannabinoid system. Every time we put cannabis on it, right, we're going to be changing it could have different effects in different people, right? Not everybody, even neurotypical people, they don't have the same profile of effects for cannabis, right? So there's no reason why an autistic person would have the same.
Yeah, so,
Real quickly,
yeah. Mhm.
what do you need us to do to help you be able to do the research you need to do and get Jeff Sessions the hell out of DOJ and whatever?
It's the funding issue. So I think that
It's a what issue?
It's a funding issue.
Funding.
All clinical trials need funding.
Yep.
From a legitimate source,
Okay.
so that we can actually do the work. So in the interest of time, let's welcome our next speaker, Dr. Da Paz from University of California, San Francisco. She's going to talk about Stress Your Superpower.
Okay, this last. Woo, all right. Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Jill and the Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area for inviting me. It is both an honor and a privilege to be here. My name is Dr. Nikko Da Paz, and I investigate stress and resilience for parents of children with autism. Is stress your superpower? That's my question. So when preparing this talk, the one thing that resonated with me was to provide a message of silver linings. Glass half full, rainbow after the storm philosophy. There is a wealth of research that paints parents of children with autism as highly depressed, extremely anxious, and constantly exposed to stressful experiences regarding caregiving. For example, by show of hands, who has not experienced a stressful event regarding their child with autism? This could be your child or a child you work with.
Today?
Who, no, ever has not, and I'm waiting. Right, this is not news. This is our reality. I include myself in that hour for several reasons. First, I began working with children with autism as an undergrad at Stanford University. I started off as an engineering major because I love numbers, and the courses stimulated my passion for problem solving. After 2 years of completing problem sets, I realized that while I love numbers, something was missing. And so, as what I thought was a distraction, I enrolled in a course working with children off campus. Turns out these children had autism, and I absolutely loved working with them. They were like walking puzzles. Everybody was different. I had to employ a different strategy just to connect with them. So needless to say, changed my major. My career after Stanford was in special education as an inclusion specialist in school districts and as an in-home behavior therapist. Now, I saw firsthand parents battling with depression and the school district all at the same time. And after nearly a decade of this, I'll be honest, I was stressed out. I didn't think that I had the resilience to continue on this path. There were no rainbows after the storm. I only saw a storm. But before I go on, I need to define stress and resilience. Scientifically, the response of stress is a response to an event. There's a leading theory by Lazarus and Folkman that places emphasis on the appraisal of that event. If the event is appraised as a challenge, then the person believes that they have the necessary skills and resources to overcome the adverse event, and adaptive coping occurs. If the event is appraised as a threat, then the person believes that the experience will cause harm, and they do not have the necessary skills or resources to handle it, and this results in a perception of stress. Now, on a physiological level, a perception of stress activates the sympathetic nervous system, and this engages a complex sequence of actions and reactions on a cellular level. For example, say you're walking along, taking a stroll, enjoying nature, and bam, you're being chased by a T-Rex. Surprising. Anybody surprised? I would be surprised, right? So this perception of threat would then mobilize your body to a fight or flight response, which then triggers a release of cortisol, also known as the stress hormone. Now, the goal of releasing cortisol is to regulate and adjust the body's responses to stress and bring the body back to a normal and less activated state. So little cortisol, that's okay, but too much, that can be damaging. Now, resilience. Concept of resilience. This implies that in the face of significant stress, adversity, tragedy, trauma, the person survives and maintains with minimal damage or stress-related harm. A resilient person bounces back from a crisis and emerges strengthened. So again, I ask you, is stress your superpower? Now, let's get back to when I was stressed out and not believing I had resilience. Basically, I didn't believe that I had the capacity or the resources to handle the daily struggles in my job or in the homes of the families that I work with. So I returned to the comfort of numbers. I returned to Stanford as a health researcher. And I worked for several years as a project manager in youth studies. And while I continued to work with families, my focus shifted from special education to special populations at risk for childhood obesity. So I found my calling. Right? Wrong. After 5 years of working at what I thought was my calling, my husband and I had a beautiful baby boy. And I remember vividly the very first time he stopped giving me eye contact. I'm sure you can guess the rest. My son was diagnosed with autism. Now, my first thought, get ready to be stressed out. Stressed in his school, stressed with his education, stressed in public, stressed in your home, stressed in your marriage. Get ready and just brace yourself for the storm. And I looked a lot like that tree. I was strong on the surface, but the bottom had definitely dropped out, and I am hanging on by my fingertips, right? Now, this was before grad school. This was before I was Dr. Da Paz, a stress and resilience researcher. I was at the beginning of my storm, and rainbows, there were no rainbows in sight. But this is a message of silver linings, glass half full. So let's switch gears, fast forward a bit, talk about resilience research. Resilience has been studied on several levels, physiological and psychological. And I'm sure you've all heard the saying, whatever doesn't kill you will make you stronger, right? Well, science has actually provided evidence that suggests this might be true. For example, in a study of lab rats, 2 groups of rats experienced 2 different conditions as infants. One group received daily manipulations, stressful manipulations, from human handling to electric shock. Now, as adults, the group that had a history of stressful experiences, they had lower cortisol levels than those who did not. And it was suggested that this repeated stress exposure led to a certain tolerance or toughening. So what about this whole idea of appraisal, right? How would this apply to an animal model? Well, this research was extended to include predictability and control. So when the stress occurred on a predictable schedule and the rats had a means of escape or control, they showed less cortisol levels than those with minimal predictability or control of their stress-related experiences. And so here, the key is perceived control. That was a key that was related to lower cortisol levels. Now let's put this in the perspective of people. As parents, whether we want to admit it or not, we know there's very little that we can control when it comes to our children or to autism. Try as we might, we are bound to be exposed to stressful experiences that are both unpredictable and inescapable. So essentially, stress is here to stay. But is that such a bad thing? So in my examination of mothers of children with autism, we found that the idea of perception had played a major role in health outcomes. It was no surprise that our parents reported a great amount of stress, actually 2 times as much as a parent who was caring for a child without autism. But because my research does not just focus on identifying stress, but on understanding what factors might promote health, I wanted to know what was unique about the parents who had a healthier cortisol profile. And so we asked parents to complete a questionnaire reporting their stress over the past month. We also collected saliva samples in order to measure their cortisol levels. And we saw a significant inverse relationship between perceived stress and cortisol. In other words, the parents who had reported greater perceived stress over the past month, they also saw lower cortisol levels. 5 minutes, I know. Okay, they also saw lower cortisol levels. And so, again, here's that question, is stress your superpower? Now, in all of the investigations that I've done, this idea of perception and control, it just keeps coming back. Again, we know we can't control autism. Doesn't stop us from trying. It doesn't stop us from wanting to make things better for our children now and in the future. And here's the hard part. It doesn't even stop us from trying to control things even when we're no longer here. Still, rainbows. So back to perception and control. I explored the effect of emotion, parent emotional adjustment to their child's diagnosis of autism. And this was a 5-year study conducted out of UCSF under the direction of Dr. Alyssa Eppel. And I examined a subset of this data to determine whether there was a relationship between psychological well-being and then parents' perception of acceptance or despair about the diagnosis. Now, we used a survey that was developed by Dr. Bryna Siegel, and what we found is that parents who reported greater despair about the diagnosis, they also reported greater burden, greater depression, and less relationship satisfaction. But on the other hand, parents who reported greater acceptance of the diagnosis, they had less depression. Now, because we know feelings, emotions, they change, we examine these relationships over time. And we found that parents whose despair reduced over time, this also reduced their burden. It improved their purpose in life as well as their life satisfaction. So what does this all mean? First, all stress is not bad. It's a natural reaction, and it can actually be useful in building resilience. But still, there is that concept of control that we all strive for, myself included. And I just did something. What happened? No, right? No control. Here, so I'm going to have to go fast. Oh, my beautiful slides. Okay. So here we go. There we go. So myself included. So wanting to control is actually what propelled me into a PhD graduate program while my husband and I were raising 2 sons with autism. So, and we were homeschooling, right? So yes to everything. Okay, silver linings. My husband and I had a second son who was also diagnosed with autism. Now, I figured that studying autism from the perspective of the parent could not only help me, but it would also allow me to help others. And while I'm still investigating, I'm still searching for those rainbows, what I have learned is that while autism can be puzzling, stressful, uncontrollable, unpredictable, these are the experiences which have strengthened me. And so if you were to ask me, is autism your superpower? I would say absolutely yes. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes for questions.
Questions? Sure.
Given that stress and fight or flight is more significant in people with autism, within autistic people, has there been parallel research about how to give autistic people greater control over their life and voices to their life so that we can reduce our stress?
Wow, that's a great question. I do not know that literature, and particularly because I know that there's a lot out there for our kids, but there's very little out there for us. And so my focus, I am focused on what can we do to help our parents. And when we talk about policies, our children, when they're diagnosed and they get this list of services, why aren't parents also getting a list of services? Because we need it too. So I hope that, yes.
Okay. It's my understanding high cortisol in general isn't a good thing.
Nope.
So us with chronic stress have lower cortisol. In the long run, is that a great thing? I mean, will we not react well when we need to? And then, I mean, I know. Actually, I can sort of know that, right? Never mind.
Yeah. So there.
Right. That's where we get to.
Yeah. So there is something called a blunted response. Right? And so what that blunted response is saying is that you are not going to have that reactivity that your body needs in order to bring yourself back down. But what I am focusing on is showing how actually this chronic stress is actually leading to a certain toughness that's happening on a cellular level for you. Is it a bad thing? I'm still studying that.
Just a quick question. So I don't know if the research exists, but for those of us who had a really acute and very negative response to diagnosis initially and had massive amounts of cortisol and all the ensuing fun stuff that comes with that, once you do recalibrate and you develop that resilience, are there any studies, longitudinal studies on the whether or not your system sort of rebounds from that injection of cortisol, kind of in the way like a smoker when they quit, like their lungs
They're
kind
still-
of regenerate?
Right. That's actually a good study.
Or has the
to
damage been
do.
done?
Well, no, because I mean, there are two types of stress. There's acute stress. There's chronic stress.
Right.
Acute stress has a definite beginning and an ending, and chronic sort of lingers. And so, it typically starts with that acute, and then you have the chronic. So, in order to determine which one, it's hard to separate those two, especially if you've been dealing with this over time. There are studies where they will bring people into a lab and stress them out by having them do presentations in front of people. And they test their cortisol levels before and after. I think that would be a way to see how your body is responding, and those studies have been done.
Okay, thank you.
So unfortunately, we have to close this session and transition to. So let's give Dr. Da Paz a round of applause.
Okay, everyone. So our last keynote panel for all of 3 minutes. So I'm going to call up Yuli. Oh, am I going to have a slide? No. Okay, so then Yuli, I can't say your last name, so don't even bother. Chapali and Kate Mobius. Yes, please come to the stage. Sit up there.
Now we can take my cortisol level.
Yes. And I can't find our third parent, so you guys get 2 minutes.
Yuli, you want to go first?
So I just wanted
Check.
Sure.
I just wanted to close the conference off and just kind of ask these two parents who've been sitting in the audience and at the conference all day, what did they learn? So if you can kind of let us know in 120 seconds or less each.
I think this is one of the most jam-packed sessions that we have done, conferences we have done. A few things I learned is these awesome programs throughout the country, man. I mean, these guys are pioneers. And every single one of them, I thought they were pioneers. And then 3 things I learned new today from my teammates is that, FEDA has superpowers. And Jill's other name is King Jong... Jill. And I didn't know that Stephen was also a great cheerleader. I mean, he was awesome there this morning. So thank you very much for all that.
Okay, thanks. Kate?
I'm Kate Mobius, and I'm kind of coming away from this conference with the imagery that Denise began with the gold filigree that repairs the crack, which sort of leads to the resilience model and what all of us have passed through, and what started initially as perhaps intense grief at one end, or maybe surprise or disappointment, has really been rechanneled into a vibrant community of what I would say is extremely high-functioning people sitting here in front of me. And I wanted to ask one question of everybody. Do you feel more hopeful after this conference? Just a show of hands on that. More hopeful, okay. So that's probably 2/3 of the room. And that's pretty good. We have many options, as Yuli mentioned, and I think that's what we all need to remember. And one final thing is just when Aiden, my son, was first diagnosed in 2003, I always looked outwards. Who's going to fix this? Who's going to help me? Who can I find? And that's now coming down to me and us and you. And that's a form of empowerment. And I thank you for that, for putting this together today.
You're welcome. Susan, you volunteered yourself.
Yeah, I guess so. Ditto. That was well said.
Thank you.
When I first came about this situation, I just thought, oh my God, how am I going to deal with all this? We're dealing. And every time I come to one of these conferences, I realize we're all dealing, and we're all getting a lot of knowledge, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's a long haul. It's a marathon. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Jill, for putting it on.
Oh, our pleasure. Our pleasure. Well, Well, with that, the clock has struck 5, and we are always so hyper punctual. So we are adjourned. Thank you so much for joining us for a very, very long day.